Morning broke slowly over the fields of Grunwald. Mist hung low above the grass, and thousands of armoured figures stood in silence, waiting. Two great armies faced each other, stretching farther than the eye could see. Banners moved in the wind, horses shifted their weight. Somewhere in the distance, a horn was about to sound. Tonight, we are going to step into one of the largest and most important battles of medieval Europe. What brought the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania into conflict with the Teutonic Order? How did this single day change the balance of power in the region? And who were the men who stood in those fields, knowing that many of them would not leave? As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you are settling into sleep or simply letting history drift through your thoughts, take a slow breath and let the story begin. In the winter months, when the rivers around the lower Vistula hardened and the roads turned firm, riders could cover long distances between the forts of Prussia. Their horses carried mail, orders, and lists of supplies. At the center of this network stood the fortress at Marienburg, a vast brick castle with high walls, storage rooms, chapels, and offices where clerks wrote in Latin and German. The Teutonic Order ran this place as a state. It held land, collected rents, regulated trade, and maintained garrisons. A visitor entering the castle would find a disciplined routine. Brothers in white cloaks attended prayers, then moved to meetings about grain stores, horse fodder, repairs to palisades, and messages from distant commanders. Many of these men came from noble families in the German lands. They had learned to manage estates and to fight in armour from a young age. In Prussia, they did both at once. They built fortified towns, invited settlers, and laid out fields in straight lines. They also planned raids, called campaigns, and kept the border in constant motion. The order had arrived in the Baltic with a clear purpose and a clear method. In the early 13th century, Polish princes on the frontier faced raids from pagan Prussian tribes. One of them, Conrad of Masovia, invited the Teutonic Knights to help. The order already existed as a religious and military brotherhood. It had grown during the crusading era in the eastern Mediterranean, then shifted north. The invitation came with land grants and promises of authority. Over time, the order secured legal support from emperors and popes, and it used that support to create a permanent base. Fort by fort, it conquered Prussian territory and absorbed it into a new political structure ruled by its Grand Master and senior officers. The conquest produced captives, tribute, and new farms. It produced resentment and resistance as well. By the early 14th century, the Teutonic state had become one of the best organized powers in the region. It controlled ports, river crossings, and trade routes. It moved goods through Danzig and Elbing, and it drew income from tolls and taxes. Wealth paid for mercenaries, arms, and the steady expansion of castles along the frontier. South and east of Prussia lay lands the order wanted and lands it feared. Poland had a long memory of what the knights had taken. In 1308, during a struggle for control of Pomerelia, the Teutonic Knights seized Gdansk and the surrounding region. Polish rulers claimed it as their own. The order held it by force and by legal arguments. The dispute hardened into a permanent grievance. It meant lost access to the sea for parts of Poland and lost revenue from a key region. It meant raids and counter-raids, lawsuits in church courts, and diplomatic missions across Europe. Poland fought the Order more than once, including the battle at Plaus in 1331, where Polish forces checked a Teutonic advance and gained a moral victory even without a decisive result. The conflict did not end. It settled into decades of tension, punctuated by truces, treaties, and renewed violence whenever conditions allowed. To the northeast stood Lithuania, a vast grand duchy of forests, rivers, and scattered fortified towns. For much of the 14th century, Lithuania remained pagan, with its ruling elite maintaining old rituals even as it engaged in diplomacy with Christian neighbours. This made Lithuania a target. The Teutonic Order used the language of crusade to justify annual expeditions into Lithuanian lands. These campaigns drew foreign knights from across Europe who wanted experience and prestige. They rode east in winter, when marshes froze and rivers became roads. They attacked villages, burned farmsteads, seized cattle, and took prisoners. Lithuanian forces responded with their own raids, striking into Prussia and the borderlands, then withdrawing into forests where heavy cavalry struggled to follow. The war became routine. It trained commanders. It created a generation that expected violence and measured status by what a man had done on campaign. Late in the 14th century, the political ground shifted. Lithuania faced pressure from several directions, including rivals in the east and the constant threat from the Teutonic frontier. Poland faced its own problems, including the need to secure succession and strengthen its position among neighbours. In 1385, a decision tied the two realms together. The Lithuanian ruler Jogaila agreed to convert to Christianity, marry the Polish queen Jadwiga, and take the Polish throne as Władysław Jagiełło. The alliance brought immediate changes that could be seen and touched. Priests arrived, churches were built, baptisms were organized. A ruler who had once been counted among pagans now sat as a Christian king, and Lithuania began to enter the formal structures of Christian Europe. The conversion removed the strongest public argument the Teutonic Order used for its campaigns. The order continued to speak as if Lithuania remained an enemy of the faith, and it continued to use force on the frontier. The change created a political problem the order could not solve, with legal briefs alone. Poland and Lithuania now held a common interest. They also gained a shared leadership circle, bound by marriage, treaties, and the practical needs of defense. Within Lithuania, another figure rose into prominence through war and negotiation. Vytautas, a cousin of Jagiełło, fought for power during a long internal struggle that involved shifting alliances with the Teutonic Order itself. At times, Vytautas sought support from the knights against his rivals. At other times, he fought them directly. These years taught him how the order operated and how its leaders thought. By the end of the 1392, Vytautas secured his position as Grand Duke of Lithuania, ruling with authority while acknowledging Jagiełło as king and senior partner. The two men needed each other. Jagiełło needed Lithuania to remain stable and allied to Poland. Vytautas needed Polish support to defend his borders and strengthen his rule. Their partnership carried tension and mutual caution, and it also carried real strategic value. The Teutonic Order watched these developments closely. Its leaders were trained administrators and experienced soldiers. They understood the new alliance could bring an army larger than anything the Order had faced in a single field battle. They also understood the political disputes remained unresolved. Samogitia lay between the Teutonic state and the Order's branch in Livonia, and control of this region mattered for movement of troops and communications. The Order pressed claims and demanded concessions. Polish leaders continued to press claims over Pomerelia and other lands seized earlier. Border raids continued, with villages burned, prisoners taken, and castles repaired in response. Letters travelled between courts, carrying accusations and requests for support. Envoys rode to emperors, kings, and bishops. Each side sought allies, money, and moral authority. By the early years of the 15th century, the region had the outward appearance of peace in some seasons, yet armed men remained close, horses stayed ready, and commanders kept maps and reports on their tables. In May 1409, men in Samogisia gathered with axes and spears and moved on the small Teutonic outposts that marked the Order's control. They knew the roads and the river crossings. They knew which storehouses held grain and which stables held horses. Some attacked at night, some waited until morning and came in groups large enough to overwhelm a thin guard. Word travelled fast across villages and through forests, carried by riders and on foot. Teutonic officials sent messages north and west asking for reinforcements, and the reports arriving at Marienburg described burned buildings, lost supplies, and local leaders who refused to submit. The uprising carried a clear meaning. Samogisia sat between the Teutonic state in Prussia and the Order's branch in Livonia. Control of that strip of land shaped travel, trade, and war. For years, the Order had treated it as a hinge in its territory. For Lithuania, it was part of a wider borderland where kinship ties and allegiance shifted from valley to valley. Grand Duke Vytautas supported the uprising, and his support turned local violence into a regional crisis. Teutonic patrols began to move in larger groups. Messengers crossed into Polish lands with warnings and demands. The Order wanted Samogisia put down and held. Lithuania wanted it pulled out of Teutonic hands. In the summer heat, the conflict moved from messages to decisions. Ulrich von Jungingen, Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, held the authority to declare war, and he used it. On 6 August 1409, he declared war on the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The Order wanted to strike fast before a large combined army could form. Teutonic columns moved into Greater Poland and Kuyavia, catching local defenders with limited time to gather. Fortified points that looked solid on a map became vulnerable when faced with siege engines, disciplined infantry, and armoured knights who knew the routines of assault. At Dobrzyn nad Wisłą, the Teutonic forces burned the castle. Smoke rose above the riverbank, visible from a distance, and people in nearby villages fled with what they could carry. At Bobroniki, the Order laid siege and pressed it for 14 days. When the place fell, it was a warning as well as a gain. Bydgoszcz was taken, towns were sacked along the route. Grain stores were emptied, livestock was driven away, captives were taken for ransom or labour. The Teutonic leadership expected panic to spread and expected Poland to split its attention between defending the countryside and protecting key crossings. Poland responded with speed that surprised the Order. Local lords raised banners. Knights arrived with retainers. Infantry gathered with spears and crossbows. King Władysław Jagiellon moved to coordinate the defence and to show political unity, because the Teutonic strategy depended on separating Poland from Lithuania and forcing each to fight alone. Polish forces counterattacked and recovered Bydgoszcz. The fighting around the town was brutal and close. Men fought in streets and at gates. The victors secured the stores and repaired defences as soon as the Teutonic troops withdrew. On the northern edge of the conflict, the Samogitians struck at Memel, the Teutonic stronghold at Klaipėda. and the attack signaled that the war would not stay confined to Polish territory. Raids spread the front wide. Each side began to face the same problem. A quick campaign required readiness, and neither side had it in full. Even the Order, with its administration and fortifications, needed time to gather a field army large enough for a decisive battle. Poland and Lithuania needed time as well, because they relied on calling up nobles, arranging supplies, and coordinating armies that used different languages and fought in different styles. As autumn arrived, the ground turned softer, and the first cold nights shifted the rhythm of travel. The pressure to pause grew, and mediation became possible. Wenceslaus, king of the Romans and king of Bohemia, offered to broker a settlement. On 8 October 1409 a truce was agreed, set to last until 24 June 1410. Men who had been riding out on raids returned to garrisons. Supplies began to move into storage instead of onto wagons for immediate use. Castles repaired damaged walls. Blacksmiths worked through the winter, making nails, rivets, and fittings for armor. Horse breeders and stable masters counted animals and planned feed. The truce did not create trust, it created time. Both sides used it with a single purpose: to prepare for a campaign that would decide the war. Diplomacy ran alongside the preparations. Envoys travelled with letters sealed in wax, and these letters carried accusations, legal arguments, and requests for aid. The Teutonic Order presented itself as a defender of Christendom, and it tried to describe its enemies as threats to the faith or as lawbreakers who had broken treaties. Poland and Lithuania responded with their own messages, pointing to the conversion of Lithuania and the Order's continued aggression. Behind the language of religion sat money and influence. The Order paid Wenceslaus a large sum, and his decision favoured the Order's claims in Samogitia, while acknowledging that the Dobrzyn land should return to Poland. The Order also paid Sigismund of Hungary a vast amount for support. Sigismund saw an opening to weaken the Polish-Lithuanian Union. He tried to tempt Vytautas with a royal crown. Vytautas understood what such a crown would mean. It would alter his relationship with Jagiellon and split the alliance at the moment it mattered most. Vytautas chose unity and secured a truce with the Livonian Order as well, reducing the risk of a second front in the north. While diplomats spoke in halls and wrote in chambers, soldiers worked with their hands. They cut timber for wagons. They gathered iron for horseshoes. They trained horses to tolerate noise, banners, and close formations. In Polish lands, nobles inspected their armor and arranged for replacements. They took stock of lances and swords. They ordered extra arrowheads. They spoke with their neighbors about where to assemble when the truce ended. In Lithuanian lands, commanders prepared a different kind of force. Lithuanian cavalry could move fast across forests and marshes, and many units fought with bows as well as spears. Vytautas drew on Ruthenian allies and sought support from Tatar horsemen. The allied army that formed would contain men with different equipment, different habits, and different prayers. Coordinating such a force required planning that went beyond the battlefield. It required agreement on roads, river crossings, and supplies. It required clear command. Jagiellon and Vytautas met and settled on a simple principle. They would bring their armies together and move as one. The Teutonic Order expected them to fail at that. The Order had reasons. Poland and Lithuania had separate interests, separate elites, and a long history that included rivalry. A combined march required trust and discipline. It also required secrecy, because the Order's castles and patrols watched the border and reported movements quickly. Teutonic commanders planned for two threats, one from Poland and one from Lithuania. They arranged garrisons with that in mind. They positioned forces where they could respond to either direction. Ulrich von Jungingen counted on that advantage. He knew his territory. He knew his roads and rivers. He believed he could meet each enemy in turn and defeat them with concentrated force. During the truce, he also gathered men from across Europe, knights who came for pay, prestige, or obligation. They arrived with their own banners and their own expectations, and they found an order that promised a campaign worthy of their armour. By June 1410, the truce stood close to its end. The decisions made during the winter and spring now shaped what would happen next. A war that began with local uprisings and border raids had grown into a contest between states. It involved kings and grand masters. It involved money, treaties, and hostages. It also involved villages that would be burned and rebuilt, and families who waited for riders to return from campaign. Jagiello and Vytautas held to their plan. Ulrich prepared to meet them. The roads out of Poland filled with armed men moving north. The roads inside Prussia filled with Teutonic patrols, moving to watch and report. The next step would be taken in marching order, with wagons behind the banners and scouts riding ahead, and the war would move toward a single day that both sides expected to control. At the end of June 1410, the roads south of the Vistula filled with wagons, spare wheels, and long lines of men walking beside horses. Some carried spears with cloth covers tied over the heads to keep the metal from catching rain. Some carried bundles of arrow shafts in canvas wraps. In villages, blacksmiths worked from dawn until dark, fitting horseshoes, repairing broken buckles, and straightening bent nails. Noblemen arrived with their retinues and took their place under familiar banners. Clerks counted who had come and who still remained on the road. Cooks set up fires near the edge of camps and boiled grain and salted meat in iron pots. Each day brought more arrivals, and each arrival created another demand for fodder, bread, and water. King Władysław Jagiello moved among these preparations with a steady routine. He met commanders in tents, listened to messengers, and sent written orders out along the routes. The plan required timing and control. It required a meeting with the Lithuanian army at a specific place on the river, and it required keeping that meeting out of the reach of Teutonic scouts for as long as possible. Grand Duke Vytautas gathered his forces far to the east, then pushed them west in a wide movement that avoided easy prediction. His army carried a different look. Many Lithuanian horsemen rode lighter, with bows and short spears, and they moved in units that could travel quickly and spread out for scouting. Ruthenian contingents arrived with their own commanders and their own banners, and they brought experience from wars along the eastern borders. Tatar horsemen joined as allies, known for fast movement and skill with the bow from horseback. Vytautas had to solve the same problems Jagiello faced. He needed to feed men and animals, keep units together on long roads, and make sure the army reached the meeting point without breaking apart from fatigue, hunger, or confusion. When his riders reached river crossings, local guides led them across. When they passed through towns, local officials provided supplies and space for camps. Orders travelled by courier, and each courier rode hard because delays could unravel the entire campaign. Inside the Teutonic state, the leadership also moved with purpose. Ulrich von Jungingen understood that a war of raids offered limited results. He wanted a decisive campaign that protected the Order's territory and struck hard enough to force a settlement on his terms. He summoned knights from across Europe, men who arrived with polished armor and strong horses, expecting a grand battle. He also hired mercenaries and arranged for infantry support, including crossbowmen and men trained to handle early cannon. The Order's castles supplied arms and stored provisions. Its officials collected taxes and made purchases in towns along the Baltic coast. Ulrich expected his enemies to come in separate columns, one Polish and one Lithuanian. He positioned forces where he believed he could block either threat, and he kept garrisons ready at key crossings and fortresses. His officers watched the border and waited for reports. When those reports came, they were often unclear. Small Polish units made movement along the frontier. Lithuanian units did the same in the north. These actions produced noise and uncertainty. They also served the Allied plan, because they kept the Teutonic leadership focused on the edges rather than the center. Near Chervinsk on the Vistula, Polish engineers assembled a bridge from boats and timbers. The work took planning and coordination. The boats had to be brought into place, anchored and tied together. Planks had to be set in a stable surface. Guards had to keep watch on both banks. When the bridge was ready, the crossing began. Wagons moved first in careful order, with men walking beside them to steady loads and keep wheels from slipping. Horses followed, then mounted knights, then infantry. The line stretched across the water in a steady flow, and the sound of hooves and wheels carried over the river. Jagiello's commanders kept strict control, so the crossing did not become a jam that could invite attack. On the far bank, units formed up and moved away from the river to clear space for those still coming. The crossing succeeded, and it changed the campaign at once. It placed the Polish army on a route that led toward Prussia with speed, and it made a meeting with Vytautas possible on ground the Teutonic Order had not expected them to use. When the Lithuanian army reached the Polish camp and the two forces joined, the scale of the combined host became clear in physical terms. The camps expanded in all directions, more fires burned. More horses crowded the picket lines, more banners rose above the tents. Jagiello and Vytautas met, spoke with their senior men, and settled on marching order. Scouts rode out in front and along the flanks. They watched roads, villages, and forest edges for any sign of Teutonic patrols. Behind the scouts came the main body, with cavalry moving in units under their banners and infantry walking in blocks with officers keeping the pace. Supply wagons moved in protected sections, and craftsmen travelled with the army to repair gear on the move. Priests travelled as well, carrying portable objects for worship and offering rites when men asked for them. The march moved north and west, and it moved with a seriousness that came from shared knowledge. Every commander understood that a battle would come, and that it would come soon. The Teutonic leadership reacted when reports finally formed a coherent picture. Polish and Lithuanian forces had combined. They had crossed the Vistula. They were moving into Teutonic territory with a direct route toward Marienburg. Ulrich faced a decision that had to be made quickly. He gathered his field army and marched to place himself between the Allied host and the heart of his state. The Order's strength lay in its castles and its disciplined heavy cavalry. Its weakness lay in the risk of being outmaneuvered by a larger combined enemy. Ulrich chose to meet the enemy in the field and to force a battle under conditions that favoured his knights. As both armies moved through Prussia, they took and burned smaller places in their path. The Allied army captured strongpoints that could not resist a large force. The Teutonic army concentrated, keeping its cohesion and avoiding being pinned against rivers or forests where movement would be restricted. Each side relied on scouts and local knowledge. Each side marched with the same basic needs: bread, meat, water, fodder, and rest. Each side kept its leaders close enough to command and far enough from danger to survive a sudden attack. By the middle of July, the distance between the armies narrowed to a day's march. Villagers watched armed columns pass, then hid their food and animals as best they could. Riders galloped back to their commanders with updates about enemy positions and direction. Jagiełła and Vytautas adjusted their pace and their formation, keeping their forces ready to stop and fight. Ulrich did the same, placing units where he expected the first contact. On the evening before the battle, camps settled into place in the countryside near the villages of Grunwald and Tannenberg. Men ate what they could and checked their gear. Horses stood with sweat drying on their flanks as grooms rubbed them down and checked their hooves. Armor was laid out, straps inspected, and blades sharpened. Officers walked among the men and gave short instructions: where to stand, who to follow, how to recognize signals. Many tried to sleep, some prayed. Some spoke quietly with the men beside them, using ordinary words about home, pay, and the weather, because that felt easier than speaking about death. The sun rose on 15 July 1410 over low fields and scattered woods between the villages of Grunwald, Stembach, and Wodwygowo. Men were already awake in both camps. They moved among wagons and tents with tasks that left no time for speech. Grooms led horses to water and rubbed down their flanks with handfuls of straw. Armor lay on the ground in pieces: breastplates, mail, gauntlets, and helmets set beside belts and straps. Servants held buckles while knights tightened them. Some men chewed bread without looking up. Others checked bowstrings and counted arrows. A few priests stood near small altars made from chests and boards, preparing for morning rites. In the Polish and Lithuanian camp, banners were still rolled or tied down until commanders called their units to form. In the Teutonic camp, the brothers of the order dressed with practiced speed. Their white surcoats with the black cross came over mail and plate. Their horses were larger and heavier, trained for charge and impact. As the light strengthened, both armies began to move out of camp and onto ground chosen for battle, each side trying to set its line on firm earth with space for cavalry to maneuver. King Władysław Jagiełła took a position where he could see the field from slightly higher ground, surrounded by guards and senior men who carried messages and watched for signals. He kept his routine in place even on this morning. Chroniclers describe him attending mass before the fighting began, and his attendants brought him the items he needed for prayer while soldiers waited in ranks. Nearby, Grand Duke Vytautas moved among the Lithuanian and Ruthenian contingents, speaking with commanders and pointing out where he wanted units placed. The Allied army formed in a broad line. On one side stood the Lithuanian wing, including light cavalry, Ruthenian banners, and Tatar horsemen, units built for speed and rapid movement. On the other side stood the Polish wing, heavy cavalry under many banners of nobles and towns, with infantry and crossbowmen placed where they could support the horse. The line carried the marks of a coalition. Different styles of armor, different shields, different flags. Men stood close enough to hear orders and far enough to swing weapons. Some crossed themselves. Some adjusted their saddle straps again and again, as if a tighter strap could steady the day. Officers rode along the front, calling names, checking spacing, and telling men to hold their position until the signal came. The Teutonic Order formed up earlier and waited longer. Ulrich von Jungingen placed his forces with care, setting his heavy cavalry in the centre and wings with infantry and supporting troops behind and between them. The order had brought cannon, early bombards that could fire stone or metal shot, and crews moved them into place where they faced the Allied line. The guns were few. Their value lay in disruption and in the chance to start the battle on Teutonic terms. Crossbowmen and other missile troops took ground in front or on the edges, ready to shoot into approaching cavalry. The main strength remained the mounted brothers and the armoured knights fighting alongside them, men who expected a direct clash. Some foreign guests stood under their own banners, men from German lands and beyond, drawn by the chance to fight in a major campaign. Their horses stood with heads lowered, breathing hard through flared nostrils. Sweat began to show under saddlecloths as the day warmed. The sun climbed and the heat grew stronger. Men shifted their weight in saddles and lifted visors for air, then lowered them again. Helmets turned into ovens. Water skins passed from hand to hand. Officers told men to stay in line. Ulrich wanted the enemy to come forward. He also wanted the fight to begin before fatigue set in. Hours passed without an advance. The Allied line held its place. Jaguo kept his men back, and the delay pressed on the Teutonic ranks. Horses stamped and pulled at reins. Knights on the Teutonic side began to show frustration in movement that officers tried to stop, a horse stepping forward, a rider turning his head to look back for orders, a man raising an arm as if to ask why they still stood. A brief rain earlier had left the ground damp in places, and it also affected the Teutonic powder. The cannon fired, but the shots did little. The noise was sharp, and the smoke drifted low, and the projectiles landed without breaking the Allied formation. Men in the Polish-Lithuanian line watched the smoke and listened for the impact. Their horses flinched and then settled. The delay continued. Jaguar's commanders kept their units in hand, and Vitortus stayed in motion along his wing, checking that men held steady. The Allied plan depended on discipline at this exact moment. A premature charge could break the line and hand the initiative to the order. Waiting carried its own cost. Men stood under armor in the sun, sweating and blinking, hands tightening on reins and weapons. The grass in front of the lines began to flatten where horses shifted their hooves and infantry planted their feet. By late morning, the battlefield looked set, like a careful arrangement that had not yet been touched. Two long lines faced each other across open ground, banners lifted and fell in the light wind. On both sides, commanders watched for small signs, a unit drifting out of line, a gap opening between banners, a horse stumbling, a messenger riding hard from one point to another. Jaguar remained guarded and steady at his post, surrounded by men ready to shield him and ready to carry his words down the line. Ulrich stayed with his chosen group of senior brothers and knights, men who expected him to give the order soon. The Teutonic force had fewer options for delay. Their cavalry stood ready for a charge that could turn into a tangle if the enemy refused to move. The men of the order looked toward the Allied line again and again, trying to read the decision that had not yet appeared. Some of them prayed. Some of them tightened their grip on lances until their hands ached. The day was already well advanced, and the fight still had not begun, and both armies stood in place with the equipment of war strapped to their bodies, waiting for the moment when a single order would send thousands forward at once. Two mounted knights rode out from the Teutonic line late in the morning, their horses stepping carefully across the uneven ground. The men wore polished armor and carried themselves with the confidence of messengers who expected to return. Each had a small escort at a distance, enough to keep them safe on the ride out and to show they came under order. One of them held two long swords by the blades, the hilts turned upward so they could be seen from far away. The metal caught the sun each time the horse shifted. As they approached the Polish-Lithuanian front, officers rode forward to meet them. The Allied soldiers watched in silence, heads turning to follow the movement. Some knights leaned forward in their saddles to see the swords more clearly. A few infantrymen raised their chins, trying to judge whether this was a trick meant to draw a charge. The envoys stopped at a distance that signaled respect and control. They waited for permission to speak. When they were brought closer, the two knights delivered a message from Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen. The message carried a simple demand. The Teutonic Order expected battle, and it wanted the Allied leaders to come forward and begin it. The envoys also offered the two swords as a sign that the order was ready and as a public insult meant to sting. The gesture said the Teutonic side believed the enemy needed help finding courage and steel. It was meant to be heard by every banner on the field. King Władysław Jagiellon received them in full view of his commanders and guards. He sat on horseback or stood near it with his attendants close, and his face stayed calm in the way a ruler practiced for years. Priests and clerks stood nearby. Commanders gathered behind him, men whose family names carried weight in Poland and in Lithuania. The envoys spoke the words they had been given. They held out the swords. Jagiellon listened without interrupting. He gave a short answer and accepted the swords, because refusing would give the Teutonic side the reaction it wanted. His answer kept the formal language of diplomacy, even when the meaning pointed toward violence. The envoys turned their horses and rode back the way they had come, keeping a steady pace that suggested they expected no attack during a parley. Behind them, the Teutonic ranks stayed in place. The field remained unchanged in its lines and its banners. The exchange, however, moved through the Allied army faster than any rider. Men repeated what they had seen: two swords, two envoys. A challenge delivered in front of both armies. In a time when honor mattered in public, the gesture could not be ignored. Officers used it as a tool. They spoke to their units and tightened discipline. Knights adjusted their helmets and settled their shields against their shoulders. Some men spat on the ground. Some made the sign of the cross. The waiting ended as a deliberate decision, and the preparations shifted into action. Vytautas rode along the Lithuanian wing with a hard pace, stopping at points where banners stood close together. He spoke with commanders who rode beside him and then carried the message down the line. Lithuanian cavalry tightened their formation. Horses were turned slightly so they could launch forward together. Light horsemen checked bowstrings and set arrows where they could be reached in one motion. Ruthenian units formed in deeper blocks, with spears angled and shields lifted. On the Polish side, captains called for order and spacing. The heavy cavalry held position in ranks that had been practiced in earlier campaigns, with the first line ready to move and the second line ready to follow. Jagiellon kept reserves behind the main line. Units held back to respond when the fight turned in a direction no one could predict. The king's guards stayed close, men chosen for strength and loyalty, each one watching the field and watching the men around the king for any sudden danger. At the edges, scouts rode out farther to watch for movement from the Teutonic wings. The sun continued to climb. The heat pressed on armor and horses. Sweat ran down faces and soaked into padded clothing under metal. Water skins were passed where they could be spared. Servants stepped back. The space between the lines remained open, a strip of ground that would be cut up by hooves and boots within minutes. On the Teutonic side, Ulrich and his senior officers watched the Allied line for signs of movement. The envoys returned and spoke to him at close range. Ulrich's posture stayed rigid and he gave short commands. His men had waited for hours in formation, and the wait had taken energy from horses and riders. Many knights lifted visors to breathe, then lowered them again when they saw the allied line beginning to stir. The Teutonic infantry held their ground near the front. Crossbowmen shifted their feet and checked their bolts. The cannon crews stood near their pieces with tools ready. The guns had already fired earlier with little effect, and the crews prepared for another attempt if a clear target presented itself. Ulrich's line carried a sense of order, with banners aligned and units placed by plan. The Order's commanders wanted a battle that favoured heavy cavalry, a direct clash where training and armour could decide the day. They also had to protect the cohesion of their line, because a break in formation would invite encirclement by a larger enemy. Knights gripped their lances and reins. Some looked toward their Grand Master for the signal to move, and some looked toward the Allied line, hoping the enemy would charge first and lose control. Jagiello's order finally moved through the Allied formation in a visible way. Standards lifted higher. Drummers and trumpeters, where they were present, prepared their signals. Officers rode forward a few paces, then turned back to face their men. The Allied line began to advance at a controlled pace. Horses stepped forward, then gathered into a walk that could become a trot on command. Infantry followed with steady feet, keeping their spacing. The movement started unevenly across the breadth of the army, then smoothed out as commanders corrected it. The distance between the lines closed slowly at first. The Teutonic side held steady, waiting to receive the advance at the moment it preferred. Ulrich's officers shouted orders that could be heard above the low rumble of movement. Crossbowmen raised their weapons. Some fired early, sending bolts into the approaching mass. The first impacts landed in shields or struck horses, and the sounds were dull and sharp depending on what was hit. Men flinched and kept moving. A few horses stumbled, and grooms or infantry tried to pull them clear. The main formation continued forward. The field that had stayed untouched through the morning now showed tracks, footprints, and churned grass. Dust began to rise, where hooves struck dry patches. The air carried the smell of sweat, leather, and hot metal. The swords that had been offered as an insult now rode with the Allied leaders as trophies and tools. Their presence meant something to men who watched symbols closely. Jagiello's acceptance of the challenge allowed him to control the start of the fight while carrying the public exchange in his favour. Ulrich's gesture had forced the decision into open view, and it had given Jagiello a clear moment to answer. The practical result appeared in the lines moving forward. Vytautas shifted his horse and looked down his wing, checking if the formation stayed aligned. He raised an arm and pointed, and commanders repeated the signal. On the Polish side, banners kept their place. Knights lowered lances and set their shields. The pace quickened. Horses moved from a walk to a trot in sections, then more broadly. Men leaned forward in saddles. The Teutonic line tightened. Knights on the Teutonic front shifted their horses a half step, setting their position for impact. The moment between advance and collision shrank to a handful of breaths, and every face behind a visor faced forward toward the enemy line. Vytautas gave the first clear signal on the right side of the Allied line, and the Lithuanian wing started forward in a movement that went from a careful trot into a full charge. Horses packed in close, shoulder to shoulder, then spread as riders looked for space. The front ranks carried spears and lances angled toward the Teutonic left, and behind them rode men with bows ready in their hands. The Tatar horsemen kept a looser order, moving in smaller groups that could shift around the edges of the formation. As the distance closed, Teutonic crossbowmen stepped forward and raised their weapons, and bolts flew into the advancing mass. Some struck shields, some struck horses. Men went down early, before any sword touched them, pulled from saddles or thrown when a horse collapsed. The riders behind pushed through gaps and kept going. The Lithuanian line hit the Teutonic left with the sound of wood breaking and metal scraping, and the first moment of impact turned into a knot of struggling horses, men shouting orders, and lances snapping into short, jagged pieces. Vytautas stayed close enough to the fighting to be seen by his commanders. He rode with a small group around him, moving along the line, pointing where he wanted units to press harder and where he wanted them to pull back and reform. The Teutonic left wing held its ground with the discipline that came from training and habit. Knights in heavy armor kept their formation in smaller groups, trying to keep horses aligned so their weight and armor could push back against the lighter cavalry. They aimed at riders who had come in too far and lost momentum, and they targeted units that had begun to spread out as the melee grew. The fighting settled into a pattern of short charges and sudden stops, with horsemen backing away to get room, then driving forward again. Men fought at close range with swords and maces. A rider could not swing wide. He struck down and forward, using the limited space between horses. Shields lifted and dropped. Horses bit and kicked. When a horse went down, the rider could become trapped under the animal and the press of bodies. Foot soldiers moved in near the edges, trying to reach riders on the ground with spears. On the Lithuanian side, archers tried to shoot into openings, looking for faces behind visors, gaps at the neck, a horse's chest. On the Teutonic side, crossbowmen shot from behind their own knights when they could see a clear line. The ground began to break under hooves and boots. Grass tore up, mud showed through. Sweat ran from helmets and soaked through padded cloth. The sun stayed high, and the heat made every piece of metal harder to wear. For a time, Vytautas's attack pressed the Teutonic left back in small steps. The movement remained uneven because parts of the Lithuanian line hit harder than others, and parts were pushed back by countercharges. Teutonic Knights advanced in wedges, trying to split groups and isolate banners. Lithuanian riders answered with quick shifts, pulling back from the worst pressure and then striking again from a slightly different angle. The fighting spread over a wide space, and it produced confusion that officers tried to control with voice and gesture. A commander could lose sight of the next banner in the dust and movement. He relied on flags and on men he recognized by armor and horse color. Vytautas sent messages along his wing by riders who pushed through the rear ranks and returned with answers. The movement stayed violent and fast, and it never paused long enough for either side to reset fully. The Teutonic line held. Its leaders understood that if they broke the Lithuanian wing, the rest of the Allied army would stand alone. They pressed harder. More Teutonic cavalry moved into the fight. More Lithuanian units were drawn in to keep the line from giving way. Then the Lithuanian wing began to pull back in a way that looked like collapse to anyone watching from a distance. The front groups turned their horses away from the Teutonic line and rode back toward the Allied rear. Some did it in order, some did it in clusters. Some riders lost control and fled at speed, looking over their shoulders. Teutonic Knights saw the movement and surged forward. They had waited through the morning, and now they saw the enemy turning away. Many lowered lances and rode in pursuit. The chase stretched the Teutonic formation. It drew knights away from the main field and away from their own infantry support. Some pursued for a short distance and then turned back to rejoin their line. Others kept going. The pursuit moved past groups of wounded men and past horses running loose. It moved toward the Lithuanian camp area and the wagons behind the Allied lines, where servants and non-combatants had been left with supplies. Some Teutonic riders began to seize equipment and valuables as they chased. They grabbed horses. They cut down tent ropes. They broke open chests. Looting took time and attention, and it scattered men who had been trained to fight in close order. Observers later disagreed on what this withdrawal meant. Some accounts described it as a rout, a moment when the Lithuanian wing lost the fight and ran. Other accounts, and later analysis, described a pattern that could fit a planned withdrawal, the kind of movement used by light cavalry in other wars, where a retreat draws pursuers out of position. The field itself offered no written answer, only bodies and tracks in the ground. What can be said with certainty is that the Lithuanian wing left the main line of contact for a period of time, and a significant number of Teutonic Knights pursued them away from the central struggle. That pursuit changed the shape of the battle. It opened space on the Teutonic left. It also reduced the number of Teutonic horsemen facing the Polish wing in the centre and on the Allied left. The cost for the Allies was immediate. Jagiello could see a large part of his right side falling back, and he could not know how many would return. His commanders had to assume the Polish banners would soon carry the weight of the fight alone. On the Polish side, the lines held position and then pressed forward as the main engagement spread. Polish heavy cavalry began to meet Teutonic units that were shifting to take advantage of the Lithuanian withdrawal. Horses collided with horses. Lances struck shields and armour. Knights fought at close distance, leaning in so their strikes landed with force. Jagiello kept his place under guard, using messengers to carry orders to the banners. He had reserves behind the line, and he faced a hard decision about when to use them. Vytautas, somewhere beyond the main field, worked to gather men who had withdrawn and to bring them back in order. Some Lithuanian units regrouped quickly. Others broke into smaller groups and rode far from the main fight. The Teutonic pursuit continued in patches across the rear area, with some knights returning and some staying engaged in the chase and the looting. The battle now had separate pockets of action, a central clash between the Polish banners and the Teutonic core, and a scattered struggle on the far side where Lithuanians and pursuers moved in and out of view. Polish banners moved forward in thick groups, each one with its own cluster of knights, squires, and supporting men on foot, and the whole line pushed into the central mass of Teutonic cavalry. Horses met at a hard angle and then slid sideways as riders fought to keep their seats. Lances were already broken in many hands, so the fight turned into sword cuts, mace blows, and short thrusts aimed at joints and gaps. The Teutonic centre held a tight formation, and its leaders tried to keep the pressure on a few key Polish banners at once. Crossbow bolts came in low arcs from behind the Teutonic line, aimed into open spaces where Polish riders had pressed too far forward. Polish infantry and crossbowmen worked behind the cavalry, ready to strike men who fell from their horses, ready to pull wounded comrades out of the crush when there was room. The sound carried across the field in bursts. A shout from a commander, the crack of wood, the clang of metal, the heavy breathing of horses forced into close contact. Jagiello stayed in his command area with guards close around him, using riders to send orders to the banners. Those riders carried short messages and looked for the right standard among dozens, because a wrong turn could place them into the Teutonic front. On the far side, Ulrich's officers did the same, and they used trumpets and hand signals when voices failed. The fight in the centre did not move in a clean line. It shifted in steps. A Teutonic group would surge forward and force a Polish banner back a few horse lengths. Then Polish reinforcements would close the gap and push again. Riders leaned over their horses' necks, using their weight to keep contact, trying to force an opening that would let them reach the enemy line behind the front. Some knights fought on foot after their horses fell. They stood in the churned ground, dragging a shield up, raising a sword for short strokes that could land in a crowd. Men on foot were at risk from hooves and from riders who could strike down from above. Still, they held their ground in pockets. Polish captains shouted for their men to stay together, to keep the banner visible, to keep a line that could move as a single body. Teutonic commanders aimed at the same thing from their side because a scattered fight would favour the larger allied army and its ability to bring more men into the field. Dust rose where hooves tore the grass and where boots dug for footing. Sweat ran down faces under helmets. Some men lifted their visors for air and dropped them again when a blade flashed near. In the middle of this struggle, a moment came that could have broken part of the Polish line. The great banner of Krakow, carried with the white eagle on a red field, stood as a visible marker of one of the most important Polish formations. Men followed it by habit and by training. Teutonic Knights drove toward it with intention, and their push tightened into a wedge aimed at the standard-bearer and his guard. Horses collided, and the banner-bearer was struck down. The standard went low, then disappeared into the crush. For a short stretch of time, men in nearby banners could not see it. Some turned their heads, trying to find the eagle among the helmets and dust. A Teutonic cheer rose from the front, because the fall of a banner mattered in a battle where formations depended on sight. Polish knights around the fallen standard fought to recover it. They pushed into the knot of bodies where it had gone down, striking at arms and reins, trying to clear enough space for a man to lift the staff. The banner came back up, tilted at first, then held higher as more men gathered around it. The sight of it upright again steadied the line. Knights who had begun to drift pulled back toward it. Officers used the moment to shout new orders, to close gaps, to move wounded men to the rear. The fight resumed at full force, and the ground around the banner stayed crowded with men who understood its value and protected it with their bodies. Jagiełło saw the pressure building and chose to commit more of his second line. Fresh Polish banners moved forward from the rear, their horses less tired, their lances still intact, their riders still tight in formation. They entered the fight where Polish units had taken the worst punishment. The new arrival changed the immediate balance. Teutonic Knights who had pressed forward now faced a new line that had room to accelerate and strike. Lances hit shields and armour with enough force to knock men back in their saddles. Horses at the front bucked and twisted under the impact. Some Teutonic riders went down and were finished by men on foot with spears. Teutonic officers tried to pull their men back into a tighter shape, and they called for their own reserves to move. The Teutonic Order had held a group of elite knights in reserve, banners kept out of the early fight, to be used at the right moment. Ulrich and his closest commanders watched the central struggle and judged where to place the force. They wanted a decisive push that could break the Polish line and reach the king's position. Messages rode back and forth. A commander pointed his sword toward a sector where Polish banners had begun to cluster. A trumpet sounded. A reserve unit started forward at a controlled pace, then quickened as it approached contact. The battle now covered a wide field in separate blocks of motion. The Lithuanian wing remained scattered out of the main centre, with groups regrouping and fighting away from the core. Teutonic Knights, who had pursued them earlier, began to return in small numbers, riding back toward the main fight with tired horses and uneven spacing. Some came without full control of their units because the chase had pulled them far and broken the order they needed. Their return added strength to the Teutonic side, and it also added confusion because they arrived in pieces. The Polish side kept its main effort concentrated, and its leaders tried to keep the field clear behind the front, so reserves could move when needed. Jagiello remained guarded and still, because movement at the command post could look like panic. His attendants stayed near, watching the edge of the fight for any enemy riders who broke through. His scribes and advisors kept close enough to hear orders. Riders came in with reports, some clear, some incomplete. A banner had taken losses, a gap had opened. A group of Teutonic Knights had pushed forward and needed to be met. Jagiello sent out instructions with short phrases and direct targets. Hold that line, support that banner, keep the reserve ready. The men who carried these messages rode hard, then slowed near the fighting to find the right leaders. As the hours passed, the field filled with men on foot, moving among horses and fallen bodies, looking for comrades, pulling wounded men toward the rear, taking prisoners when a knight was surrounded and could no longer fight. Captives were valuable, and men tried to keep them alive while still protecting themselves. Some Teutonic knights fought to the last in small circles, backs close together, shields raised, striking at any man who came within reach. Polish and Allied men used spears to probe for openings, then stepped back when a sword cut swung out. The central battle did not end in one sudden break. It turned through many small turns, each one decided by a reserve arriving, a banner holding its place, a commander falling, a group losing cohesion and being pushed back. By late afternoon, the struggle tightened again, and the next decision point approached, with Ulrich preparing to commit his best remaining force, and Jagiello watching for the moment he would have to answer. Ulrich von Jungingen gathered what remained of his best-mounted banners and brought them forward in a tight block, keeping them close enough to move as one body. The men around him carried the black cross on white cloth, and many wore plate over mail with closed helmets that left only narrow slits for the eyes. Their horses were already tired from hours of fighting, yet the riders forced them into a short trot that turned into a charge once they found open ground. The point of the push was clear from the direction. It aimed into the sectors where Polish banners had taken the most punishment and where gaps kept opening and closing in the press of riders. Teutonic lances came down, shields rose. The first impact drove men back, not far, a few lengths at a time, yet enough to change the shape of the fight. Knights who had been trading short blows at a standstill suddenly found themselves pushed sideways by a moving wall of horses. Foot soldiers near the front stepped away to avoid hooves. Some were trapped and knocked down. The Teutonic charge kept rolling because Ulrich stayed at the head, and because officers behind him shouted for their men to keep forward, keep tight, keep the banners together. Polish commanders answered with quick orders. They called in riders from nearby banners to close the line and to hit the Teutonic flanks before the push could cut deeper. The air filled with dust and the smell of sweat and hot metal. A man could see only a few bodies ahead and to either side. He relied on the pull of his banner group and the pressure of horses to tell him where to turn. The charge carried Teutonic riders close to the area where King Władysław Jagiello stood with his guard. The king remained behind the main fighting line, yet the battle had shifted in waves all day, and this wave came far enough to threaten his position. A handful of Teutonic knights broke through in the confusion, either by choice or because the press carried them there, and they rode toward the cluster of men around the royal standard and the guarded space where messengers came and went. Jagiello's attendants reacted at once. Guards moved forward with spears and swords. Horses were turned to block the line of approach. One Teutonic knight pressed in close and raised his weapon to strike, and the movement forced the king's men into a tight circle around him. Zbigniew Oleśnicki, a cleric in the king's service who wore armor on this field, struck at the attacker and brought him down, and other guards finished the fight around the fallen horse. The king stayed upright and in control, and his presence mattered because officers watched him for signs. A visible retreat from the command post could spread confusion. Jagiełło's men held the ground, pushed the intruders back, and reopened the space for messengers. The Teutonic surge continued in the center, yet the attempt to reach the king's position had failed, and the men who tried it were either dead or forced away from their units. Ulrich's push began to slow as Polish banners gathered against it from several sides. Fresh riders hit the Teutonic flanks and forced the block to lose its clean edge. Horses collided at awkward angles. Lances struck and then snapped into short pieces. The fight returned to close contact, with swords and maces landing in short arcs, with riders leaning in and trying to pull each other from saddles. Ulrich stayed in the thick of it, moving with his guard because he expected his presence to hold the men together. That choice placed him where the danger was greatest. At the same time, movement returned on the far side of the field. Groups from Vytautas's wing came back in force. Some had regrouped in the rear and returned in organized clusters under their banners. Others arrived as smaller bands of riders who recognized the main fight and aimed for the Teutonic rear. Their return changed the situation in a physical way. Teutonic Knights, who had ridden forward all afternoon, now faced riders striking from the side and behind. Men turned in saddles to see what was coming. A knight could not keep his shield facing every direction. A horse could not push forward while also protecting its hindquarters from spears and arrows. Teutonic formations began to bend. Some riders tried to pull out and form a new line, yet the space was filled with bodies and the movement of horses, and units that had been split earlier by pursuit and scattered fighting could not come back together quickly. Ulrich fought inside this tightening circle of enemies. The details of his death were recorded by chroniclers who relied on reports from survivors, and the field itself offered only the final result. Ulrich fell during the struggle, killed among the mounted press, and the men on foot who struck upward with spears and swords at riders who had lost room to maneuver. Once word spread that the Grand Master was down, the effect travelled through the Teutonic side in visible actions. Some banners kept fighting because their officers still stood and because men around them expected to hold. Other groups pulled back and began to ride away from the centre, looking for open ground where they could escape or regroup. Teutonic leaders who remained alive tried to take control, yet they had lost many senior commanders earlier in the day and now lost the man whose authority held the whole army together. The Polish banners pressed harder. Lithuanian and Ruthenian riders struck at retreating groups and cut them off from the road back to their camp. Prisoners were taken when knights were surrounded and forced from their horses. Others fought until they could no longer lift a weapon. The battle line that had looked so organized in the morning now broke into separate fights scattered across the field, each one decided by who could keep men together and who could still move. Teutonic banners began to drift backward in small groups once Ulrich von Jungingen fell, and the drift turned into movement with purpose as riders searched for a way out of the press. A few commanders tried to hold their men together by shouting and pointing their weapons toward open ground, and some knights answered and formed short lines that faced the attackers. Others rode through gaps with their heads down, pushing their horses hard, trying to reach the rear where the baggage and wagons stood. Polish banners pressed forward in blocks, and Lithuanian and Ruthenian riders came in from the side, cutting across the paths the Teutonic Knights wanted to use. The fight became a series of collisions in different places, instead of one clear front. A Teutonic group would turn and strike, then break apart when horses came in from two directions. Polish foot soldiers moved up behind their cavalry, and they used spears to reach riders who had been slowed or pulled down. Captures happened in the same space as killing. A knight who lost his horse could be surrounded, his arms held, his helmet pulled off, then marched to the rear under guard. Another knight fought on foot with his back against a fallen horse, swinging in short strokes until he went down. The field filled with men walking and stumbling through mud, looking for their banner, looking for a commander, looking for a clear path away from the crush of bodies. Horses ran loose with empty saddles, breathing hard, eyes wide, their tack flapping as they moved. The retreat toward the Teutonic camp drew the battle into the place where wagons, spare gear, food stores, and tents had been left under lighter guard. Teutonic officers tried to turn the camp into a defensive position. Wagons were pulled into a rough line and set wheel to wheel, and men carried shields and spears into the gaps. Some of the brothers of the Order and their allies formed a last stand there because the open field offered less protection and because the camp held water, supplies, and a sense of direction. Polish and Allied riders arrived in waves. Some came in tight formation under banners. Others arrived in scattered groups after pursuit and fighting, and they found the camp already in motion, with men shouting and running between wagons. The attackers rode close, then dismounted when space tightened. Foot fighting took over. Men pushed through openings between wagons. Spears struck upward at riders who still tried to fight from the saddle. Crossbows fired at close range. Blades struck against helmets and plates with short, hard blows. Camp servants and drivers became part of the scene as they tried to protect themselves, grab valuable items, or run. Some fled into nearby woods. Some were caught between the lines and killed. The ground inside the camp was crowded with horses, bundles, torn cloth, broken chests, and men trying to drag wounded comrades away from the press. As the camp defense failed, the last organized Teutonic resistance broke into small knots of men who fought in place. A few held a banner upright until they were surrounded and forced down. Others tried to bargain for quarter when they saw they had no path out. The Allies took many prisoners, especially nobles and knights who could pay ransom. Guards were assigned, and captives were moved back toward safer ground, often with their hands bound or with a man holding their bridle and leading them like a horse. Polish commanders shouted to keep the pursuit controlled, because a scattered chase could lead to ambush or to losing track of units. The battlefield itself made control difficult. Dust and smoke reduced visibility. Broken weapons and bodies lay in the paths. Horses slipped in mud where blood and rain had mixed. Men stepped over the fallen with quick glances to see if a friend still breathed. The sun moved lower, and the light shifted, and the length of shadows on the ground gave the clearest signal that the fight had lasted for hours. In the later afternoon, the remaining Teutonic groups who could still ride tried to leave the field toward the north and west, aiming for the road to Marienburg. Lithuanian riders chased some of them and cut down stragglers. Others escaped in small numbers, spread out over the countryside, carrying news of the defeat. By evening, the Allies held the field and the camp, and the work changed from fighting to sorting what had happened. Commanders gathered near their banners and counted who remained. Messengers rode to Jagiello with reports that came in pieces. A banner had lost half its men. Another banner had held together through the worst of the melee. Captives were gathered in groups, and guards were posted. Priests moved among the wounded, and men brought water in buckets and skins. Some wounded lay quiet. Others called for help in hoarse voices. Horses were led to water and fed where fodder remained, because an army that planned to march still needed its animals. Jagiello's staff began to arrange the most urgent tasks, securing the captured Teutonic standards, setting sentries, and locating the bodies of major leaders. Ulrich's body was found among the dead, identified by those who knew his armor and by men who had seen him in the press. The body was treated as the body of a high noble, because even in victory there were rules for rank. It was carried away from the heap of fallen men and placed under guard. The same happened with other senior Teutonic officers who were recognized because the victors understood the value of bodies for negotiation and for proof. Night came with the army still spread across the field, and the campfires grew in number. Men cooked what they could and ate in silence or spoke in short sentences. They had spent the day shouting over horses and metal. Many now spoke quietly to the men beside them. Some searched for friends and relatives among the wounded and the dead. They lifted helmets to look at faces and moved on when they found a stranger. Others sat on the ground and pulled off gauntlets to see the state of their hands, swollen fingers, torn skin, blood that had dried into the seams. Captives sat under guard in separate clusters, their armor removed or loosened, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. Guards watched them closely, because a desperate man could still take a weapon from the ground and run. Jagiello held councils with his senior commanders, and Vytautas did the same with the men of his wing. They spoke about the next day and the road ahead. They had won the battle that mattered most, yet the war still had walls and castles. Marienburg stood in the distance, beyond rivers and roads. The Allied army rested on ground it had taken by force, and the leaders prepared to turn victory into a result that could be carried back to their kingdoms. In the first light on 16 July 1410, men walked the field with lists and with lanterns held low. They looked for wounded friends and for officers who had not reported in the night. Guards stood around clusters of prisoners, and captives sat on the ground with their hands bound or with their reins held by a soldier assigned to them. Armor lay in piles where it had been pulled off the dead, and servants sorted usable straps and buckles from torn cloth. Horses were led away from the worst ground, watered, then tied again in long lines near the camps. Jagiello's staff set up a working space with tables and chests, and clerks wrote down names and marks from captured banners so the king could know which Teutonic units had been destroyed and which commanders had fallen. Priests moved among the wounded, and the wounded asked for water, asked for a bandage, asked for a word sent to a brother or a father in another banner. Vytautas held quick councils with his commanders on the far side of the camp and gave orders to gather stragglers and restore discipline among units that had scattered during the fighting. Polish commanders did the same, because victory created its own danger when men began to wander in search of loot. Jagiello's orders were practical. Keep the army together, keep the prisoners secure. Prepare the march. The battle had broken the Teutonic field army, and the next step was to reach the centre of the Teutonic state before it could assemble another defence. The army moved within days, and the march looked like work more than celebration. Wagons formed up in long lines, and infantry walked beside them to keep wheels moving through soft ground. Scouts rode ahead to villages and crossings, searching for Teutonic patrols and for any castle that might hold out. The road toward Marienburg ran through a landscape that still belonged to the Order, with forts and towns built to support its rule. Some places opened their gates quickly after hearing that Ulrich and many senior officers were dead. Others resisted until they saw the size of the Allied host gathered outside their walls. Jagiello's commanders sent detachments to take strongpoints that could threaten the supply line, and those detachments returned with captured stores and more prisoners. The Allied army carried food for only so long. It needed local supplies, and it needed roads that could carry wagons. Each delay had a cost measured in sacks of grain and in exhausted horses. Jagiello and Vytautas kept moving, and yet the march still slowed at moments because the army was large, because it carried wounded men, and because commanders had to keep their banners in order. The path was also shaped by the time needed to deal with the dead and with the captured leaders. Important bodies were guarded. Important captives were kept under close watch because their ransom would later pay for horses, armor, and political agreements. Inside Marienburg, the men who remained in the Teutonic leadership faced a crisis that could be seen in simple facts. The Grand Master was dead. Many commanders were dead. The field army was gone. The castle still stood. Its walls were thick, its gates were strong, and it held stores. Heinrich von Plauen, a senior commander who had not fought at Grunwald, moved quickly to take charge of the defense. He gathered men who had survived, brought in garrisons from other castles, and ordered repairs and preparations. Supplies were counted and rationed. Weapons were distributed. Patrols watched the roads. Messengers rode to nearby towns and forts demanding loyalty and men. When the Allied army approached, the defenders could see dust clouds and hear the movement of wagons and horses long before the front of the host came into view. They closed the gates. They manned the walls. They prepared to withstand a siege because the field battle had already been lost and the castle offered the only chance to preserve the Order's state. The siege began in late July 1410, and it became a contest of labour and endurance. Allied troops spread out around the fortress and set up camps in a wide arc. They dug trenches and built earthworks where they could, and they placed what artillery they had in positions that might reach the walls. They cut timber for platforms and for shelters, and they moved wagons into defensive lines to protect their own camps against sorties. The defenders answered with their own actions. They repaired damaged sections of wall, reinforced gates, and sent out armed groups in short attacks to burn siege equipment and disrupt work crews. The defenders had the advantage of stone and brick and height. The attackers had the advantage of numbers, yet numbers meant more mouths to feed. Food became the central problem. Local villages had already been stripped by marching armies, and supply wagons had to travel farther. Horses needed fodder, men needed bread and meat, sick men needed care. Heat and crowded camps created illness. Latrines filled, water sources became strained. Jagiello's council had to consider each day of siege as a calculation of stores and stamina. The Allied army had won a battle that lasted a day. It now faced a siege that could last weeks, with each week measured in supplies and in discipline. As August moved on, the siege failed to deliver a quick result. The castle held, the defenders stayed active and controlled. Von Plauen kept order on the walls and punished any sign of panic or desertion. Jagiello kept his army in place and tried to maintain pressure. Vytautas pushed for action, and some assaults were attempted at points where the attackers believed the walls could be tested. The results were costly. Men climbed ladders and were driven back. Missiles struck into crowded groups at the base of the walls. Bodies had to be carried away and buried. The Allied army continued to capture some other Teutonic strongholds in the region. yet Marienburg remained intact. By September, the practical limits of the siege became clear. Supplies ran low, horses weakened, men began to drift away from camp to search for food. Some banners needed to return home for harvest and for political obligations. Jagiello faced the need to preserve the strength of his army for the rest of the war, and he ordered a withdrawal. The Allied host pulled away from the fortress, leaving behind burned earthworks and empty campsites, and the defenders remained in possession of the castle that anchored the Teutonic state. The war did not end at Marienburg, yet the battlefield victory had already changed what would happen next. News of Grunwald had travelled to cities and courts, and people responded in visible ways. In Poland, churches held services of thanks, and nobles spoke of the victory in gatherings where they counted their dead and praised the banners that held. In Lithuania, Vytautas used the victory to strengthen his authority among nobles and commanders who had seen his leadership in the field. In Teutonic lands, officials raised funds, repaired garrisons, and tried to keep towns loyal under the fear that the Allied army would return. The order also faced a financial crisis caused by the ransom of prisoners and the need to replace the men and horses lost in the battle. Negotiations began to move alongside military actions. Envoys travelled under safe conduct, terms were proposed and rejected. Captives were counted and valued because a knight and a noble could be exchanged for a large sum, and those sums mattered for everyone involved. In February 1411, representatives met in the city of Thorn to set terms that could be sealed and enforced. They brought documents, seals, and witnesses, and they spoke through interpreters and legal advisors when needed. The agreement returned the Dobrin land to Poland. It also addressed Samogitia, the territory that had helped ignite the war. Control of Samogitia went to Lithuania, tied to the lifetimes of Jagiello and Vytautas, and the clause reflected how closely both sides watched the future. The Teutonic Order also accepted a heavy financial obligation connected to the release of prisoners and compensation. Payments were set in installments, and the order began to raise money by loans and by new taxes on its towns and subjects. Officials collected silver and moved it under guard. The strain created unrest in Prussian cities and among nobles who resented the cost and the leadership that had brought them into disaster. Jagiello returned with prestige and with political strength, and he also carried the reality that the Teutonic state still existed behind its walls, weakened and wounded, yet alive. In the months after the treaty, Teutonic officials travelled through Prussian towns with account books and sealed instructions. They met city councils, guild leaders, and local nobles in halls where the walls held banners and religious images, and they spoke about payments that had to be made. The order needed silver. It needed it to meet the ransom obligations for prisoners and the compensation required by the settlement. It also needed it to rebuild forces, repair castles, and keep mercenaries in service. The officials did not ask with gentle words. They imposed taxes, demanded loans, and required towns to provide goods at fixed prices. Merchants counted the cost in ledgers and tried to keep trade moving through ports and along rivers because commerce offered the only steady way to gather money. Some towns resisted through delays and arguments, and some complied quickly out of fear of punishment. The strain could be seen in simple details. A city council ordered new levies, a guild reduced wages, a farmer sold grain early to pay a fee. When the order took church treasure to meet a payment, the act travelled by rumour and by complaint because it touched sacred objects and exposed how far the crisis had gone. The Teutonic state still held its castles and its ports, yet it now carried debt and the memory of a battle that had killed much of its leadership in a single day. Heinrich von Plauen used force and strict discipline to keep the order together after the defeat. He rewarded loyalty and punished those he believed had failed. He set garrisons and ordered patrols. He tried to stabilize the frontier and prevent more uprisings in places where the order's authority had weakened. He also faced internal criticism. The loss at Grunwald had removed many senior men who might have shared leadership. It left a narrower circle of authority, and it increased suspicion inside the order. Knights argued over blame and over strategy. Some held that Ulrich's decision to fight a pitched battle had been reckless. Some believed the pursuit of the Lithuanian wing and the looting had damaged the Teutonic line at the moment when cohesion mattered most. Others spoke about signs and divine judgment, because medieval men often used religious language to explain disaster. In the practical world of governance, the outcome was plain. The order had fewer trained brothers, fewer horses, and a financial burden that forced it to demand more from its subjects. That combination created the beginning of a long decline in stability. In Poland, the victory strengthened Jagiełło's position in a way that could be seen in court politics and in the behavior of nobles. Men who had questioned the union with Lithuania now had a clear proof that the alliance could defeat the most feared military order in the region. Jagiełło used the prestige from the victory to manage internal factions, reward loyal families, and maintain control over appointments and policy. He hosted councils where nobles gathered under banners that had fought at Grunwald, and the men who stood there carried fresh status because they had survived the field. In Lithuania, Vytautas used the victory for his own position as well. He remained the central authority in the Grand Duchy and strengthened ties with the Ruthenian lands that made up a large part of his state. He also pursued his own ambitions on the eastern frontiers because a reduced Teutonic threat gave him room to focus on other concerns. Both leaders understood that their partnership had become an instrument of power. Their personal relationship and their shared military success made the union more than a written agreement. It became a working system that could move large armies and coordinate policy across vast territory. The region around the Baltic did not settle into peace for long. The Teutonic Order and the Polish-Lithuanian Union remained in contact through embassies and through border tensions, and each side continued to prepare for further conflict. Smaller wars followed. In 1414, a new campaign broke out that later chroniclers called the Hunger War because both sides used scorched earth tactics to deny supplies. Villages burned again, crops were destroyed, herds were driven away, armies marched and then stalled when food ran out. These later wars did not carry the same scale as Grunwald, yet they mattered because they kept pressure on the Teutonic economy and kept the border in motion. The order tried to hold Samogitia through political maneuvers and through local influence, and Lithuania worked to secure it as part of its state. The issue remained difficult because Samogitia sat in a place where control depended on forts, roads, and local loyalty. In 1422, the Treaty of Melno settled the border in a more durable way. Samogitia stayed under Lithuanian control, and the agreement marked the end of the order's main crusading claim in the region. This was a political result that flowed from the outcome at Grunwald, because the order could no longer impose its will through repeated field campaigns. Inside Prussia, the long financial strain and the changing balance of power created unrest that grew over decades. Towns that had gained wealth through trade began to resent the order's taxes and restrictions. Noble families in Prussian lands also developed their own interests and wanted greater influence. The Order's government remained centralized and often rigid, which made negotiation difficult. Over time, opposition took a more organized form. Prussian towns and nobles began to build alliances among themselves. They sent petitions. They used legal arguments. They also used the threat of force when they believed the order would not change. By the middle of the 15th century, the conflict between the order and its own subjects contributed to a larger war. In 1454, the 13 Years' War began between the Polish crown and the Teutonic Order, supported by the Prussian Confederation of Towns and Nobles. This later war ended with the Second Peace of Thorn in 1466, which cut the Teutonic state in half. The western part became Royal Prussia under Polish authority, including key cities and the region around Marienburg. The eastern part remained under the Order as a reduced state, and the Grand Master acknowledged the Polish king as overlord. These changes came long after Grunwald, yet they followed the same direction of movement that began on the field in 1410. The Order survived in a transformed condition, and its transformation became visible in the early 16th century. In 1525, the Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg made a decision that ended the Order's rule in Prussia as a religious military state. He secularized the territory, adopted Lutheranism, and became Duke of Prussia under the authority of the Polish crown. The public ceremony of homage in Kraków placed the new duke before the Polish king, and it showed how far the balance had shifted since the days when Teutonic Knights rode out from Marienburg on crusade. The Teutonic state became a duchy, and the military order lost its sovereignty in that region. The change did not erase the Order's history, yet it turned it into a different kind of institution, with fewer political tools and less independent power. For Poland and Lithuania, the long arc of these events meant a growing position in the region. Their union continued and later became formalized in new agreements, culminating in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1569. That state became one of the largest in Europe, and its roots lay in the practical cooperation that Jagiello and Vytautas had practiced during the war against the Order. Men returned to the field in later years with spades and carts, because the work after a battle did not end when the army marched away. Bodies had to be buried, armor and weapons had to be gathered. Wood from broken lances and wagon parts had to be cleared from paths. Local farmers and villagers took what they could use. Some pieces went into barns and sheds. Some were traded. Some were melted down. The scars on the ground softened over time. Grass grew again. New fences were built. The place kept its names: Grunwald, Stembark, and nearby villages, and travellers carried stories that tied those names to the day in 1410. In Poland and Lithuania, the victory was remembered in the behaviour of courts and cities. Kings and nobles spoke about it in councils. Clergy mentioned it in sermons. Families told younger sons about the day older men rode out under banners and came back fewer. In the Teutonic lands, the memory carried a different tone. It became a warning about pride and about the risk of bringing an army into open field against a larger coalition. It also became a point of anger and grief for families who had lost brothers and fathers. The memory turned into objects and into public acts. Captured Teutonic standards were displayed as proof of the victory, and the story of the two swords remained attached to the opening of the battle. People spoke about them as items that had been offered by the Teutonic envoys and accepted by Jagiello, and the swords became symbols tied to the union of the two allied powers. In the years that followed, Royal ceremonies and anniversaries used these kinds of symbols because medieval states worked through visible signs. A banner carried through a city street told a story without words. A sword, shown in a hall, carried the meaning of conquest and authority. Written chronicles also fixed the battle in memory. Jan Długosz, a Polish cleric and historian writing later in the 15th century, produced a detailed narrative that became one of the best-known accounts, and his writing shaped how later generations imagined the battle. His descriptions of the Lithuanian withdrawal, the fall of the Krakow banner, and the death of Ulrich carried weight because they were repeated and taught see through his authority. Other sources existed as well, including accounts from the Teutonic side and the short chronicle often called the Chronica Conflictus, which offered a different voice and emphasis. Each text carried the limits of what the writer could know, and each chose which moments to highlight. Over time, readers treated these choices as facts as much as they treated the events. Centuries later, the battle entered art with a force that changed how it looked in the public mind. In 1878, the Polish painter Jan Matejko completed his large painting of the battle, filled with figures, weapons, and specific faces drawn from historical tradition. He placed Vytautas in a prominent position and showed Ulrich at the center of violence, surrounded by men at close range. The painting travelled through exhibitions and reproductions, and it became part of Polish national culture at a time when Poland did not exist as an independent state. People saw in the painting a proof of past strength and a reminder of what they wanted to recover. During the period of partitions, when Poland was divided among empires, the battle served as a reference point for identity. Lithuanians also held their own memory of the battle under the name Žalgiris, and the name itself carried pride. The memory became part of language, and language shaped how people thought about what belonged to them. Organizations, sports clubs, and civic groups took names tied to the battle to place themselves inside that tradition. The memory also became contested in modern politics. German historians and national thinkers used the name Tannenberg, tied to the nearby village, and the name carried a story of loss. In August 1914, when German forces defeated a Russian army in East Prussia during the first months of the First World War, the German command named the victory the Battle of Tannenberg. The choice was deliberate. It attached a modern victory to a medieval defeat and presented the new battle as a correction of the old. The naming produced ceremonies and monuments, including the Tannenberg Memorial, built in the interwar years, a large structure meant to honor German war dead and to project national meaning. The politics around memory grew sharper in the 20th century. In the Second World War, Nazi officials used medieval symbols for propaganda, including the image of the Teutonic Order, and they saw in the medieval crusading state a precursor to their own plans in the East. Poles and Lithuanians held to the opposing memory, the memory of a coalition that defeated an invading order. After the war, new borders placed the battlefield area within Poland, and public commemoration took a new form under a different political system. Monuments and anniversaries continued, and official speeches used the battle as a point of pride. Today, the field remains a physical place with roads, trees, and open stretches of ground. Visitors can stand and look across the distance where the lines once formed. They can visit museums and view reconstructions. They can attend annual reenactments where thousands of participants wear armor and carry banners, and where horses move in controlled charges across open ground under supervision. The reenactments do not carry the danger of the original. Yet they show something real about the scale of the event and the effort required to move so many armed men at once. They also show that memory continues through action. People travel, camp, cook, and perform roles to connect themselves to the past. The battle becomes a date on a calendar that brings crowds and attention. Historians continue to argue about specific details, including numbers, formations, and the exact sequence of some actions. The limits of sources keep some questions open, and archaeology adds small pieces through finds of arrowheads, armor fragments, and other materials recovered in the area. Each find adds a fact tied to a place and a moment. A bent metal fragment can tell a story about impact and position. A cluster of arrowheads can suggest where archers stood and where cavalry moved through. The human level of the story remains visible because the battle was fought by people who needed food, water, rest, and leadership. Jagiello and Vytautas made decisions based on reports and on the ability of men to move. Ulrich made decisions based on his training and his expectations of how the enemy would fight. Knights and infantrymen fought in heat and fatigue, and many died in a few hours, their names written in family records or lost completely. Captives spent months in confinement, while families gathered money for ransom. Towns paid taxes to meet obligations. Farmers rebuilt after armies moved through their land. These details kept unfolding long after the day of battle. The memory of Grunwald became strong because it contained clear outcomes and because it connected to later events that people could see in maps and treaties. The Teutonic Order never recovered its earlier position. The Polish-Lithuanian Union gained strength and continued to shape the region's politics for centuries.